Okay, just, if you work in this stuff a long time, I just want you all to see if this rings a bell for you. I mean, if you do this kind of work that we all in this room do, you kind of come across a lot of caricatures. This just came to mind to me on, what's today? On Tuesday. Somebody was asking what are people like that fold into these different camps, whole language camps and phonics camps, and what else is there? Reading recovery camps and so forth and so on. And I don't know how it looks, but it kind of looks like this. If the way these people are described, the phonics kind of camp goes something like, if you were just looking at somebody, it would be, right? And the whole language type of caricature would seem to be kind of a Leo Biscaglia thing. Oh, let's just put everything together, come together, and put this, and let's be so natural. Let's just love it, put everything. Reading recovery is more like this. You gonna teach me how to teach reading? And then somebody said, what do researchers look like at this other meeting? And they kind of look like this. And they talk like this. Have you ever noticed? You want to say, is this the way you talked when you were 6 years of age? Did I have a notion about this? Notion is a big word on campus. All right. On the charts from the Foreman study, the title was Predicted Growth in Word Reading, Why Predicted and Not Actual. Any assessment of anything is a prediction. That's all. Whenever you measure anything with a test, it's a single slice of behavior at one point in time. It's a prediction of what maybe the world looks like for that person. So to be totally honest about assessments, any point of an assessment is a prediction about how you think that human being's going to do at any point in time. And the reason, that's why assessments have to be done over time. A fella in the audience asked me during the break was, it seems that for policy and practice we generally do pre- and post-tests. And you were mentioning that those weren't the best way to do things. Well, not in research. They're certainly not the best way to do things. They can give you a window if you're looking at kids' progress over time. I think, as you'll see, as the technology gets a bit better and we can translate how you look at these data over time in easier ways, then you'll be looking at children periodically across each year so that you get an idea of not only the distance children have traveled in whatever you're teaching them, but the rate of their learning. And those are two critical elements. Generally, pre- and post measures only give you the distance in learning, right? They don't tell you how fast or when the kid kicked in terms of responding to a particular kind of instruction. And that's what I was trying to put up with the individual growth curves. You can see youngsters going along after certain conditions are being presented by a certain way, and then they seem to hit and begin to increase quite a bit in their skills. Other kids don't obviously increase as much and so forth and so on. But where we would like to be in 5 years is to be able to predict why certain children move quickly and some don't, why some children don't move at all, and what those influences are. And again, in the graph I was showing you, you can watch an individual kid go along not making much improvement, let's say, in reading speed and accuracy, and at some point in the training begin to get those concepts. Is that just because the program is kicking in? Or can we factor in the classroom program in addition to a tutorial that might be having an effect? Or can we see if, in fact, the type of reading activities at home are influencing something? You can actually get about that detailed. So what we're trying to do is make the research that you're seeing ecologically valid so we can move as many influences into the equation as you can without losing the objectivity of the metrics. Because what we know just from ourselves and the way we look at individual kids over time is what we think we're seeing children do, sometimes ethnographically. In a lot of our shops, we're kind of making up as we go along. In other words, we see what we want to see. It's a human thing, and we do it all the time. So I hope that explains that. But predicted something on assessment is anytime you give an assessment, you're predicting what a kid's going to be able to do at any point in time. It's just a little teeny sliver of whatever. So. Okay, do we not use any phonemic awareness or phonics instruction with a kid who is 10 and has missed the window of opportunity? I probably didn't explain that well. In order to read fluently and accurately to construct meaning, you're going to have these foundational things. The point I was trying to make is in the longitudinal studies, you can see that earlier is better. The time it takes to move a skill like reading accuracy and fluency along so it impacts comprehension may take 30 minutes to 40 minutes per day with a child, but that quadruples by about the 4th grade. You guys could see that all the time. Now, why is that? Are there sensitive or critical periods there, brain-wise? Even if there are, that doesn't say you can't teach the kids. To me, it's just a lot of factors hitting at one time that I don't think we'll ever disentangle, frankly. Kids' motivation might be lower. We don't have enough time with the child. The connection between the youngster's tutorial or special ed program and his classroom program may not be so great. So that's why I'm trying to harp on young. Early is better, frankly. Can we teach kids at 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 at 16 and 21? Yeah, you sure can. You got to get ready for doubling or quadrupling, actually, the intensity and the duration of that intervention. So kids can certainly learn, so can adults. But it's, again, going to require these same kinds of components, phonology, phonics, and a lot of textual reading practice with great interesting stuff for them to move along. And since Louisa does the heavy lifting, she's got all the tough questions. That's all I have.
Come on, here, some more.
Okay. Are you doing any work with second language learners? And if so, what are you doing? We're not. We're starting next year, but we've had to try to figure out what all this means in a language that we understand fairly well. At UCLA, Claude Goldenberg does some good work with English as a second language, and I would contact Claude. He's doing the kind of work that goes after the common sense questions that come up before you. If you got, for example, Spanish-speaking youngsters, do they need to learn about reading in their native language before they move over to English? Does there need to be the same kind of representations of reading concepts, given that Spanish, for example, is much more regular than English? And how does all that work out? I don't know a good deal about it. I do know we're not studying it as much as we should, but frankly, you have to prioritize. So we've been trying to go after what it means in English. When will the discrepancy model change? That's a tough one. That's as much political as anything, but of course everything is, isn't it? Here's the problem with discrepancy models. First of all, like anything, we over-apply them. If you'll remember, discrepancy models are used in the diagnosis or the identification, rather, of learning disabilities. By statutory law, learning disabilities is composed of 7 categories: listening, speaking, basic reading skills, reading comprehension, arithmetic calculation, arithmetic reasoning, and written language. So you can ostensibly be identified as an LD student in any one or several of those areas. Now, the mistake that's been made is this. The discrepancy came about as a proxy for a construct. Let me put that in English. LD came into being not as a scientific category, but mainly as an advocacy, socially driven category. If you all remember, in the mid-'60s, there wasn't a special ed category for kids who were failing in the academic areas unless they were blind or visually impaired, hearing impaired, orthopedically impaired, mentally retarded, or emotionally disturbed. So you had a lot of kids who were bright, not emotionally disturbed, all the exclusions, if you will, who were not learning to read, write, do math, and whatever. So parents and professionals built a category called learning disabilities to tie federal funds to it so there could be special education for these kinds of kids that didn't fit extant categories. Now, because you have to have a gatekeeping system for who is a certain category and who isn't, I mean, I'm not sure if mental retardation is the same, but remember, it used to be sub-average intellectual functioning originating during the developmental period and associated with impairments in adaptive behavior. So you would give, you remember that? You give an IQ test and the adaptive behavior measures, and if they met those criteria, the kids were mentally retarded at some level. The LD gatekeeping mechanism was a discrepancy because that's a proxy or a replacement for the the reason LD started way back centuries ago, which is unexpected underachievement. In other words, learning disabled children are unexpectedly performing poorly, given that they're generally average to above in intelligence, given that they've had an adequate opportunity to learn, given that they are motivated, at least for, and they're not the other things, the exclusions. They're typically not emotionally disturbed yet. They're not whatever. And so the IQ is a measure of potential, right? And you subtract from that the measure of achievement in any one or more of these 7 areas. But as you've seen in reading, if you take the whole universe of poor readers, the majority of them are reading poorly because of these code issues we've been talking about all day. Although quite a few readers will read up the wazoo very nicely, quickly, and still not comprehend. But that's a smaller percentage. And in fact, a lot of mentally retarded kids can read words very well and not comprehend very well. So here's the kind of mistake we've made in this, using this discrepancy. The IQ achievement discrepancy may be a good marker for aptitude achievement with some learning disabilities, but not with others. So it may be a good marker in reading comprehension. It may be a good marker in mathematics reasoning. But how could you use an IQ test to predict where these basic reading skills should be when the IQ and the reading skills at that level don't correlate? You saw it in the brain. The modular systems responsible for phonological awareness and coding are somewhat separate from the cognitive systems that an IQ test goes after. So if we were to use a discrepancy model in the basic reading areas where most kids are having their difficulty, one might better use listening comprehension as the aptitude measure, if we ever had a good measure of listening comprehension, because if you think about it, listening comprehension shows you what that child would be able to comprehend if the data were able to be gotten through print. And that is what a discrepancy should measure, aptitude against what is. You with me? Is it making sense? So IQ achievement in the biggest area of LD is measured by IQ measures as the aptitude measure, and it doesn't predict the criterion or the achievement level itself. When will that change? It's until we get a replacement, such as a better listening comprehension test, and validate all of these kinds of things. I'm not sure. My view on this is, frankly, one that says, why even use these discrepancies, frankly? I mean, if a kid's got a reading problem, they got a reading problem. Now, look, one of the things that in all of these studies we do is, all right, I'll split in every study we have, I mean, we look at a lot of children to test these issues. Let me do it this way. In all the samples, let's say we're all 8 years of age in here, we split the sample such that all of us on this side of all of you guys on this side of the room, because Wheezy's on this side of the room, have IQs of way above average. I can look at you and tell that. Anyway, all right, so you're all 110 above, around 130 IQ, full scale IQ. Unfortunately, you're reading at about a 65 where the average is 100. Okay, so do you have a discrepancy? Do you? All right, just for today, do I still get paid if I do this? All right. We have IQs of about 75 to 80, guys, just for today. And we're reading at a matched level at about 65 to 70. Do we have a discrepancy? No, we don't. It's not significant. Now, since you guys are there with the discrepancy and we're here, one thing we can do is study whether or not the reading problems we have at this level of reading, decoding, word recognition, are different, since you guys are a lot smarter on IQ tests. But they're not. The same kinds of things that cause your reading difficulties in terms of slow, laborious decoding and word recognition is the same thing that causes ours. Are the genetics different? No. Is the neurophysiology different? No. So why in the world, at this level of reading, where most kids enter the system, unfortunately too late, would we be using a marker that in fact is invalid for the behavior that we're trying to look at? So what I would, what would be wonderful is if we could get everybody, I don't know if this will ever happen, on the same page with respect to what does it take for kids to learn how to read, and it takes these things we've talked about today, and trying to get all teachers on the same page with respect to understanding about sound structure and phonics and weaving that into a good contextual reading program, and realizing that flexibility is a key here for children with discrepancies or no discrepancies who have a lot of these skills. You don't need to bang them over the head with it. You know, a lot of people have asked me even today that since you know all this, does every child need to go through these kinds of phonologic awareness training programs or whatever you've seen here? Of course not. I mean, if kids have it, why would you teach it to them? Now, that's easier said than done because we haven't yet figured out critical issues like how much phonologic awareness do you need to get to good phonics? How much phonics do you need? Those are critical threshold questions that are being studied hard now. So we don't over-teach kids in certain areas where they don't need that. But you know, the fact is when you use an IQ test as a marker and a discrepancy as a marker, you're going to wait to fail. There's no doubt about that because psychometrically it won't pop until the kids failed a couple of years. But it seems to me that if we got to kids early and they actually began to read better, even if they looked lower in IQ at first, we know that good reading development boosts IQ nicely. And unfortunately, we know the converse, that lousy reading decreases verbal IQ dramatically. If you follow these kids over time, you see a good 115 verbal IQs down to 92 by the 9th grade. That's a big drop, but it's fairly typical. So the key to reducing our reliance on these artificial gatekeeping mechanisms is helping our teachers to be better prepared, however we do that, and to be able to communicate with one another about what the critical conditions are that children need to have in place in order to do the skill well. Because we know that special regular education arrangements haven't complemented each other well, and we know that there's not a lot of generalization from special education even when the kids do well, unless you program for that. So I know I get pie in the sky when I'm talking at this level, but teacher preparation, as I tell different congressional subcommittees, is the big black hole. Teachers at the universities and colleges, professors don't have enough time to prepare all of this because of their constraints. There's sometimes a mismatch between what the state says teachers need to know and what is taught at the university. There's all kinds of very complex issues that have to be worked out. So I'll get off that soapbox. All right.
The instructional practices we saw presented in the video were so similar to success for all, exclamation point. And I'm thinking, yeah, hooray, actually, if we're employing valid practices, probably from program to program, we should see a lot of similarities. Now, it just so happened that this teacher in the classrooms that we filmed were not in Success for All schools, but we would want to see some basic principles in place. And we could have 10 or 15 wonderful models that employ validated principles in somewhat different ways, and they would still all be powerful programs that could all move kids along. So those principles, as we've tried to lay them out today, again, are recognition of the linguistic systems that are indispensable for learning to read, the necessity for recognizing and addressing those explicitly and systematically in instruction for children who show weaknesses in any of those systems. And by those systems, I mean phonology, a sense of the symbol system, that's orthography, a sense of the meaningful parts in words, that's morphology, a sense of syntax or how sentences work, a sense of the organization of meaning, that's semantics, the ability to put that all together fluently, that's kind of a separate issue in and of itself in reading development, and the ability to deal with larger units of text, and that is to understand narrative and expository text, poetic text, which has a different form, the ability to comprehend and compose it. Those are all components of the reading process and reading skill. So our programs need to recognize that those need to be learned. If we have children who learn them quickly and easily, great. Spend time on something else. If we have those high numbers of children who are weak in the foundation level skills, we need to address those systematically. So we developed those lessons on the basis of principles, not on the basis of any published program, but we would hope those would be components of any really well-designed program. And that brings me to this next set of questions, which I'm keep hoping you'll run out of videotape right now, Mark, because the questions basically are, what about the reading materials that are on the state adoption list? You want me to answer this? Uh-oh. Okay, let me be careful and say, certainly there are materials on the state adoption list that are much better than others. How do we know that? We know that because there are materials that have deliberately incorporated direct and systematic instruction in all of these layers of language organization that are necessary for a proficient reader to master, and have provided integrated activities, that is, lesson plans that skillfully move children from one level of language processing to another, and that skillfully integrate practice and component skills with real reading and writing, and that skillfully integrate the skills component of teaching with the thematically more meaningful components of language arts. There is validation data for at least one of those programs that's on the state adoption list. Some of the others have not been tested in the way that that particular program has been tested. So I think you have to make these decisions on the basis of what we know about reading development, what's really important. So for example, if there's a program that directs teachers to place heavy emphasis on guessing as a primary strategy for word recognition, I would say, look again. All right, have I said enough? Okay, no. I would also say some of the, there are several publishers who've designed what look to be very nicely integrated bilingual strands in their reading programs now, so that there's a Spanish strand and English strand that are thematically unified. So you can have children in a bilingual program who are reading the same material, studying the same things, learning the same concepts, but some in Spanish and some in English, that look very good. And there's several publishers who have done that. In the absence of the kind of validation studies we would like, we need to take a careful look at what the components of the program are, not what the publisher says they are, and maybe even select some classrooms that will do a pilot of a program so the teachers who are experienced can work with the materials and understand whether they would really work in practice and whether they are designed to follow these principles of reading development that are at least fairly well established in the main at this point. That's all we can do. But there are obvious transgressions of those principles in the design of some of the materials that are now on the adoption list. So you can at least rule out those.
Dr. Lyon, please comment on why teachers tend to teach based on their intuition rather than on research findings.
I think to some degree perceiving what children need and want from an adult's perspective is at the root of some of our inability to stretch and entertain different points of view. In other words, I hear adults talk frequently about the fact that kids are going to be bored silly by reading books that have some phonetically regular pattern in them or are decodable in nature with respect to their text. If you watch any 5, 6, and 7-year-old, they frequently bring the same book back to you to have the same story read time and time again. We know from a good deal of work that what children appreciate about learning is if they do it well, and if they are moving along fluently and automatically in any skill. And anything we can do to support that, obviously, is what we would want to do. I think there's an arrogance with adults that somehow places on children our motivations and our beliefs, when in fact the youngster's in an acquisition stage and we've already learned something, and we're bringing to bear this previous learning on youngsters in their tender developmental stages, when what they want to do is do well and learn these kinds of things. And certainly believe it does get in the way. Well, people don't understand, because some kids come to reading quite easily, that in fact it's a complex and delicate series of skills which have to be mastered, so that certain things have to be learned by kids at certain stages of development in reading if they're going to get anything out of it. Now, clearly, the idea that children can learn to read easily if they're read to, or if they are just exposed to literature by an individual who might be interested in their reading development, is not an appropriate way to think about it. The idea that children will learn to read naturally upon some exposure, for example, if they are being read to, that they'll pick up the critical skills in learning to read, is simply nonsense. In order to learn to read the English language, you've got to develop a sound foundation. You have to understand that the words that we hear are in fact composed or made up of teeny sounds. It is those teeny sounds that will map on top of the letters that present themselves on a page of print. And when you don't know what a word is initially, you have to decipher that particular word, because our language is a code. Reading to children to inculcate that skill misses the point, because in reading to children, children still can't hear by listening that words are made up of teeny sounds. For many kids, they have to have a concrete representation that in fact a word like big or cat or anti-disestablishmentarianism is made up of segments of speech sounds, and the job is to connect sounds to the spellings in front of them. Children need to understand the sound foundation of our language. They need to integrate that very fluently into the reading process via phonics, and then that also has to be deployed into literature context so that they get a great deal of practice and boost their fluency and rapidity in reading. If children are just read to and expected to in fact develop all of these skills in their complexity, then we are going to leave I would say more than half of our children behind in school.
What should be happening at the university for preparing teachers to teach reading?
Teacher preparation, as it's traditionally structured, is immune to accountability for a number of reasons. There are concepts that have to do with academic freedom, that have to do with tenure in colleges of education. And colleges of education sometimes operate as do the liberal arts with respect to presenting multiple points of view that may or may not have any validity. But teacher preparation should be very similar to the preparation of physicians, in that the core body of knowledge that's known at that time needs to be translated as rigorously as it can to practice, such that we help as many children as we can on the basis of validated findings, and we do no harm. Changing the culture of colleges of education will probably not occur unless there is substantial influence from the consumers of the products of colleges of education. Parents, schools, legislators might begin to increase the level of accountability just by virtue of the lack of learning a lot of our youngsters are showing us, particularly in the areas of reading. To be able to change traditional preparation practices within the academic setting would require an enormous change in the way business is done with respect to tenure and academic freedom. I mean, we have a lot of converging evidence that tells us the ability to read and like to read and continue to read depends upon the development of some complex linguistic skills, phonological awareness, the ability to name letters in front of you rapidly, the ability to blend sounds together rapidly, the ability to apply phonics concepts to words you've never seen before, the ability to move those concepts effectively into textual presentation so that you're rapid and fluent and you put all your energies in getting the meaning rather than in decoding, and so on. Given the complexity of those skills and their interrelationships in the learning to read process, it simply follows that teachers must understand what those skills are, when they're expected to develop, when impediments occur in any one or several of those skills, what happens to the child, and most importantly, when the youngster is coming to the reading act and is slow and labored and non-automatic and missing the beauty of literature because they can't comprehend well, teachers must be able to unpack or understand which of these conditions are not totally developed or well developed, if you will, such that they get a good deal out of reading. Teachers frequently want so much to have the best information to guide their instructional practice. But as we study teachers and teacher preparation, we find, to be very direct about this, that teacher preparation is in large part extremely superficial and non-systematic, so that as teachers who are working hard to develop a professional sense and a professional content are generally taught theories that don't relate directly to their teaching practice. They're generally taught methods with the expectation that these teaching methods or these methods for reading will fit all children equally well. They are not taught to think about the teaching of reading as a dynamic conceptual exercise by asking themselves, okay, here's a child in front of me. What do kids need to have? What do they need to learn in order to be a good reader? And thus, if they are not a good reader, to figure out which of those things aren't in place that they can bolster. They're generally taught that this method will apply to most of the children I have. That kind of preparation, that method-driven type of preparation, or one-size-fits-all preparation, makes our teachers extremely vulnerable to switches or changes in philosophies that come down the pike when their method of choice goes out of vogue. The more our teachers are beholding to a certain approach and to a lot of the vigor that goes along with these approaches, the less likely they're open to incorporate different kinds of teaching practices or concepts in their repertoire. How do we change that? This is probably one of the greatest questions in front of us, the toughest to solve. Clearly, teachers teach what they know, and if they are getting this superficial preparation, then we have the responsibility of helping university and college faculty be deeply exposed, and that's really not the right word. We need to have teaching faculty who presently prepare our teachers become deeply aware and knowledgeable about what we now understand is critical for the development of reading skills. And to, after learning that content, understand that teachers, like any students in complex situations, cannot benefit just from lecture. They need to have the concepts explained. They need to watch those concepts come alive as children develop. They need to watch how teaching and instruction follows or provides children with and without these concepts certain representations so that they get the idea. They need to watch experts do that, just as in any profession. They need to see models and demonstrations of elegant practice that brings the content or the knowledge about what it takes to read with the pedagogy or the delivery of instruction to move those concepts across. They then also need to be gradually placed into positions of increasing complexity with children who have different ways of developing reading skills, from children who initially get the ideas very quickly to youngsters who then struggle and thus actually need a wonderful teacher. You figure a lot of our teachers are trained, frankly, more as presenters of information rather than as teachers. That is, the one-size-fits-all is a series of points that they may present to an audience, but when somebody doesn't get it, the job of the teacher is then to show those ideas in different ways. And if we train them in such a parochial fashion that they don't have other examples to get these ideas across, then we see people getting into trouble. So the knowledge that we have about reading must be integrated nicely with the delivery of instruction. Teachers need to watch experts doing that. Teachers then need to be given guided practice in working with both different levels of complexity with individual children and then numbers of children in terms of planning their instruction and grouping practices, and need to have guided and supervised practice along those lines. It's only until we take seriously the very difficult task of training people in complex decision-making situations that we are in fact probably going to see teachers become more confident and less vulnerable to the shifts and whims of policy kinds of things, and so on. And it's also very clear that even if we have a teacher preparation mechanism or system in action which goes toward this deeper goal that we have of making sure teachers know their content, know their pedagogy, and understand individual differences in kids, that if those teachers graduate and then go to schools where the schools themselves are parochial in methodology, where only one size fits all, for the survival of that teacher, she or he will probably set aside all those wonderful skills they learned and fit in with the flow. So we have multiple levels of preparation. We have to help university and college faculty become much more knowledgeable about the research findings and become much more knowledgeable about what constitutes good research and what discriminates good scientific research from that which is mediocre or non-informative at all. There is a big difference between research that can inform practice and research that is published in journals that frankly doesn't have much to say about much at all. So those distinctions have to be made. Our college and university faculty simply have got to come up to speed and begin to integrate the more recent and converging research findings with their practices as we present those findings to teachers. That must be done in a very thoughtful environment where, again, the information is provided, the information is demonstrated, the teachers use that information under guided practice conditions, and their ultimate clinical home where they go to is also informed and reinforces those practices once they get there.